before we go into some questions or some topics that I want to discuss, I thought it would be good for everybody to have like a basic foundation of what these sculptures are and why they're here. Max Ernst, as Michael mentioned, was one of the foremost artists of the Surrealist and Dada movements, the co-founder of Surrealism, in fact, one of the pioneering and greatest artists of the 20th century by many measures. And by 1938, he was romantically involved with the visionary artist Leonora Carrington. And they met in Paris, they were living together, and they decided that with the war and the tensions that were happening in the capital, to decamp to the south of France. And they bought a home in Saint-Martin d'Ardèche. And in this beautiful home, which really served as an oasis for them, many of their artists were their artist friends, like the iconic Lee Miller and Man Ray and Yves Tanguy and Roland Penrose and Leonore Feeney were all there, and many, many others with them in this beautiful, idyllic setting in the south of France. And it was there that Max took upon himself to make this home and turn it into an entire work of art in and of itself. So he carved and made all of these sculptures on the home, and then a lot of it is in a collaborative way with Leonora. What happened, though, was in 1939, Max was arrested as a foreign enemy, and then, with the help of his surrealist friends, was able to escape. But then he was arrested again in May of 1940 by the Gestapo this time. And at that point in time, Leonora leaves, Max escapes again, and he ends up making his way to the United States ultimately with the help of his third wife, Peggy Guggenheim. So Max ends up returning to this beautiful home in Saint-Martin d'Ardèche in about 1971, I think it was, and after the war. And it was always his intention to cast these sculptures from this home that we now know served as a very important artistic, collaborative experiment for him. And sadly, he died in 1976 and never had the opportunity to oversee it. But his widower, who he married shortly after arriving in the United States, the great artist in her own right, Dorothea Tanning, worked with Ernst's family and the great foundry, Suze Frère in Paris, who Max had always worked with, to go back to the house to recast these sculptures. So these are casts from the home in and of itself, and these actually are the only complete suite of 12 that we know of. It is the first in the edition of 8. We believe maybe only 4 or 5 of the editions have ever been casted. And this is the first time they've ever shown together anywhere. And I was lucky enough that the Tanning family offered them to me several years back. And it was funny because at first we're like, yes, we'd love these. And then we're like, what are we doing with these big things? They sat in storage, you know? And then as, I don't know, fate, luck, whatever you want to call it, would have it, about a year ago, SHVO opened this park. And it was like, you know, right away I knew that's where we're taking these sculptures. So, you know, that's in part, you know, why we're here tonight. In 1992, the French government made this house a historic landmark. This is where it sits today. And so that's the basic foundation now that you know kind of what we're looking at here. And also, what I've been thinking a lot about, and we talked a little bit about it, is marks the 100-year anniversary of Surrealism. So I'm thinking about the historical context 100 years later, what matters and why people are talking about Surrealism, and Max Ernst obviously has been the central of all of these shows. And I guess I'm going to open it up with you, Claudia, if you want to just comment about like 100 years in surrealism.
Well, I'm glad you bring it up because I was going to open by saying that, over the past, first of all, thank you for bringing this work here. I think it's tremendous to be able to see it, and especially to see it for the first time and to see it in the setting, and I will come back to that in a minute. But, over the past few years already, we've seen a huge embrace in contemporary art of young painters all over the world, embracing a surrealist vocabulary. And it's been sort of like really evolving over the past few years, and it's getting stronger and stronger. And of course, that is not a coincidence at all. Both Mike and you touched upon the historical context in which surrealism developed. We're thinking about the beginnings of Dada, surrealism, how war and the experience of crisis shaped an artistic movement cannot be thought apart from what this movement is. And so, if we're thinking about Max Ernst as one of the foremost artists of surrealism, as you said, a co-founder, one of its most sort of original proponents, he had a way of describing surrealism as a poetics of out-of-placeness, which I think is a really beautiful way to think about it. And of course, the way that he articulated that visually, and as have all of the artists that were associated with this movement. But first and foremost in his work was through the means of collage, which was a literal cutting things out of place and reconfiguring it in different circumstances. So taking a hand from an arm and putting it elsewhere is putting something out of place and reconfiguring with something else in a way that is a poetics of its own and that is deeply grounded in an existential experience of suddenly finding yourself in a world that you don't understand, that is pervaded by violence, destruction, that sort of permeates sort of like this sense of out of placeness that is physical, mental, intellectual, and how to translate that into a visual language. I was really struck by the way that he put it. I think, if you think of his biography alone, I mean, he has described 1914 as the year that he died, 1918, the year that he was resurrected. And he comes out of the war and he plunges sort of like himself into the throes of Dada, which of course is the precursor of the surrealist movement. So there is this deep grounding in a profoundly tumultuous, upside down experience of the world that is tied to conflict and war. And obviously this has been brewing over the last few years quite significantly. And so it's not surprising to me at all that we see a resurgence of that kind of attempt to create different visions of the world that are tied to realism, right? I mean, realism, as we talked earlier, Eric, realism was the thing that Max abhorred because what is real, right? I mean, and realism, the kind of, that the reality that was sort of like propagated as valid and true at the time is what led, to a First World War, to a Second World War, etc. And so he was really opposed to the idea of realism. And so to create a visual world, a vocabulary of that is so distinct makes sense, sort of like in that context, makes sense then and makes sense now. And so that's why it's really exciting to have this work here at this very particular moment in time, not just because it's the 100th anniversary, because really because of what that actually means for the times that we are living in. And how can this work made in 38, 39 speak somehow also to the current moment that we're in? And that's why I'm really excited to be here and to have the opportunity to see and think about this work with you. Because you know, we're talking about 1938, 39. I mean, he had already been branded a degenerate artist in Germany. He didn't have a home. He moved to Paris. He was, surrounding himself with like-minded artists. And, and then here he is in 1938, 39, after France enters the war as an enemy of France. And so, I mean, he was a person whose whole life, I mean, at least in these sort of like, world event instances, was defined by a sense of out of placeness, and how that translates into the work, I find very intriguing.
I love that. I mean, right? It's brilliant. I would love to hear like what you know anecdotally from your father or mother, or from, your grandfather. What stories do you know of this period? I mean, I know everybody in the 3 people have already planted. Can you ask him what Max said of that time period? What he ever said of Leonora? I'm really curious to hear from you on that.
Well, since I would generally visit with Max in the company of Dorothea, Leonora's name didn't come up too often. I would say that relative to what Claudia has said, and this it may not sound as intellectually sort of entertaining, but the world that Max had to confront in the immediate post-war period, as post-World War I period, as all the artists of that period did, the Dadaists, who felt that society had failed them, and that the only solution was to reject all of society. Dada was an art movement that was anti-art. The very first surrealist Dada exhibition, you had to enter through a men's urinal, and at the end of which was a pretty little German girl in communion dress reciting obscene German limericks. Then once you entered the exhibition, there was an ARP sculpture, a wooden Jean ARP sculpture with an axe next to it, inviting guests to improve upon the piece. Dada was successful to the point that it became respectable. And when it became respectable, all the Dada artists said, basically, the hell with this. We want no part of society. We want no part of acceptance. Surrealism came out of that as a much more inwardly drawn sense of finding logic in a world of illogic. The sense that we have a connection to that today is that, well, reality can suck sometimes. And the ability to, well, like Aldous Huxley's book, Doors of Perception. The surrealists basically believed that the reality that you and I share, the concrete reality of this chair, is just one level of reality. And that the reality that we deal with in our dreams is as real as that which we face every day. And that it was only through kind of an acceptance of that Freudian sensibility that dreams are real was a way of rejecting elements of society that they felt were offensive. I'm not sure that answered the question.
It didn't, but it was great. I expect nothing less, actually. I just didn't know if you had, I mean, did you ever hear him reference the time, these sculptures, Saint Martin d'Ardèche, the times between the war, the internments? I'm just curious.
No, he wouldn't speak of his time in the war. It was horrific. I have a series of drawings that he made when he was in the German army of things that he would occupy himself when he's waiting in the trench. But he never spoke of that period. And as I said, his relationship with Lenora was not one that he would have felt comfortable bringing up, in Dorothea's presence. She was a bit mercurial, and I think she was in no small part jealous of Lenora, because whatever love and affection he had for Dorothea, and I have no doubt that it was genuine, Lenora was really his true love. And I think that the failure of that was something that he never quite, got over it. So it wasn't something that she never came up.
You
Can
said
I,
so, oh,
can I ask? Yeah, I'm just curious also, just to follow up on that. Did he ever speak about just the fact of leaving behind this work? I mean, less about her, let's say, but also just about what leaving this place in such a rush, having to go to America, what it meant to him to have to leave this work behind. I mean, obviously we know he went back to find it, but I'm curious, did he ever say something about that?
No, and I think, when he went back to look at it was probably more of a sort of trip down memory lane. And I'm guessing would have been somewhat uncomfortable for him. Because, as I said, these things came out of a very difficult period for him, and if only because there seemed to be a sensibility that you can see in the works that there's a cloud descending. I mean, Max's work, his sculptural work, and the other times he did sculpture, the one thing that is emblematic of that, there's a sense of whimsy, a sense of sort of like poking fun at the world. These works carry much more of a sense of portent. The idea that what was happening outside the village of Ardèche was something that was physically felt and was very dark. And so looking at these pieces, you really don't get that sense of him trying to poke fun at the world. You almost get the sense, like in this piece here, that you can't see because it's facing away from you, but which appeared on the front area of the house in Ardèche, it's kind of like a demon to repel evil things. They're not comfortable works in many cases. Even works, like the one over there, the Lop Lop of, this bird figure, has a certain, not menace to it, but it's raising its arms up almost in defense of the house that it was placed in front of. So Max is, I have to confess that I didn't talk art with Max. I was, at that point in my life, when I would visit him, I was much more interested in playing center field for the New York Yankees. And Max also had, his relationship to young male relatives, of which I was the only one, was fraught with a little more angst than all my female cousins from Germany who would be visiting him often when I was there. And he almost seemed a little uncomfortable with my presence because quite often roosters don't like another cock in the hen house.
Speaking of the rooster, since you mentioned this sculpture over there and the Lop Lop, it's really when you look at the images of the house, I was really struck at how in this particular instance of the casting of the sculpture, how the two elements, there's really two elements to this work. If you look at the facade of the house, one is another version of Lop Lop, whose head we see, I think, over here on that side. Yeah. High, very, very, very high up on the facade. And he has his arms raised like this, right? And he's looking up. And it's even more menacing, I think, sort of like the combination of the two.
Well, I think the works were designed almost as talisman to keep evil at bay.
Yeah.
And they failed.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because that base sort of like mimics a little bit the fact that was sort of a pilaster or a pillar. So it's like these two figures are actually holding up the house.
Well, and it's also
and,
in the photographs of the original piece, there are also, and this is unfortunate, the works did, a number of the works that were on the house in Ardèche didn't survive.
Yeah.
And so that piece was almost meant to be as part of a circular piece. There were two other pieces. There was the image above it, and then you had a female image holding the head of a lion to the left side. And those don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So it's a bit, unfortunately, incomplete in that regard, because you'd almost have to assume, much like a frieze, that they were meant to be viewed as a group. But ultimately, as I say, these were talismans. And my grandfather, much as he was unorthodox as a German, was nevertheless prone to the Germanic sense that nature is ultimately mysterious and exists outside of our realm. If the stories that in German history of the Black Forest, and if you look at other works of Max, the giant frog, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I own one, so I should know it. But that these were all manifestations of nature as a bulwark against mankind's evil.
I'm glad you bring up the forest, because I was really interested in talking about that. The forest, needless to say, is a really important image motif in his work. And it is, as you described, it's always sort of this nearly menacing presence, these incredibly densely sort of like put together, nearly impenetrable scenes of trees. And then he does it later on with jungles as well. And it goes back to, according to him, or his notes at least, this goes back to his experience of sort of like being taken to the forest south of Cologne at the age of 4, which I have visited too, and I had a very different reaction to. But it was very interesting for me to sort of think of these paintings and how he thinks of the forest, as you just so beautifully described, and then realize that we are actually sort of like sitting within a forest,
right,
which is not quite as foreboding and dense, obviously, as those in Max Ernst's painting.
But this is much more of a respite.
It is much more of a respite. But I still sort of like, when you sort of like, put blinders around you and sort of like just turn around and look through the sort of trunks here, I was wondering how he, whether he would be pleased or not, or sort of like by the fact that these sculptures actually are presented sort of in the context of a redwood forest.
Oh, I think he would be very pleased. I think he would find this to be a very refreshingly unique context.
Yeah.
He did a few public sculptures in, I'm trying to remember the town. It's near Weem, where he did a lot of his sculptural work. And I think that he was never as enamored of the traditional staid gallery context. But as you say, his fascination with nature and with the mysteries that it provides was something that fit within the context of surrealism, which is constantly posing questions that you cannot have any answers to.
Yeah, the irrational, and sort of the forest was this place that was both foreboding and enchanting, and well, no wonder that all the German, fairy tales are basically set in those types of forests too, right? What I love about being here and seeing it in the set is because of all of this context, is that there's some sort of, in my head, there was sort of like an interesting switch that happened where like all the creatures that sort of he conjures from the forest in his paintings, right, that look out at us, like somehow his sculptures here become these creatures, these chimera, these monsters, that we're usually only finding in his paintings of forests.
Well, especially in these works, because, as I said, these are rather unusual by Max's normal standard of sculpture. They're not whimsical. They're not really fun in the same ways that the others were. And given the historical context in which he was doing them, that makes a lot of sense. That's further underscored if you look at the paintings he was doing at the time, like Europe After the Rains, or the Anti-Pope, or even the Robing of the Bride, which he painted for Peggy. There's a serious sense of unease, disquiet, fear, horror, because the world, he recognized, and I think many of the artists did, that the world that they had grown up in, the world that they had rejected, was nevertheless going to be worse than they'd ever imagined it could possibly be. I mean, look, the idea of Max and a lot of these artists moving to America, that was pretty much the worst case scenario you could possibly have. They looked at America as being a backwater, without culture or any sense of artistic history. And on some level, in contemporary terms, they weren't necessarily incorrect. I mean, you had the painters of the American West and, the grand visions that they were creating. But beyond them, the only two American painters that Europeans had ever heard of were Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. And Benton was the only one that they liked.
Can we talk a little bit about, picking up on this theme, symbolism, mythology, and maybe even nicknames? Because we've referred to Lop Lop over there and Lop Lop up here. And I just for the audience, Lop Lop was his nickname that he gave himself, right? Or you're going to share that story.
It was his alter ego.
Right.
And it appears, I think the first time it appeared was in an early Dada collage in the early 1920s, 24, 23. And art historians have spent countless time and wasted any number of reams of paper trying to figure out, okay, we know Lop Lop is Max's alter ego. Where did he get the name? What's it mean? And some writers, like Werner Spies, who is Max's Boswell, he searched and could never quite find the rationale. In my father's book, my father is Max's son, he wrote a book called A Not So Still Life, which is all about the artists he grew up with and is considered by a number of writers to be one of the better books written by an artist about being an artist. And in that book, you've all seen Citizen Kane, right? Rosebud. Rosebud is the personification of innocence. Innocence lost. Innocence you keep trying to find. Lop Lop serves the exact same purpose. When my father was about 3 years old, and Max had already moved to Paris and left his wife and Jimmy, but he would come back and visit and stay at the house and work in the studio there. And he gave Jimmy a large rocking horse. And as he would push Jimmy on the rocking horse, he would make the noise of a horse. Lop, 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 lop. And so the idea being that Lop Lop for him was an indicator of the innocent world that he wished existed, that he wished he belonged to, which is less dramatic than most art historians would like to have. They'd like something a little more sort of weighted with cultural import. But that's ostensibly what it comes out of, because Max was at bottom a big kid. For those of you who are familiar with his work, unlike most artists, he didn't, find a specific style and stay with it. I described earlier today that he was almost like somebody with ADD. He'd be doing something and he'd look over and go, "Ooh, what's that?" And then start getting involved in that. This is within the context of artists and people who enjoy art. This is always a wonderful thing, because the idea that you develop this signature style that can be, from 50 yards away, oh, that's a Morris Lewis exhibition, or Kenneth Noland, or, really definable styles. That for Max, it was more the idea of keeping his brain engaged and constantly searching for new ways to express these ideas that he had without giving really any care to how it was accepted. I'd mentioned to Wendi earlier, there was a retrospective of Max's work at the Metropolitan Museum in New York back around 2003 or 4, and the New York Times critic, Hodig Carter, decried Max's diversity of style, saying that, and this is an almost exact quote, "It's disconcerting for the art shopper in all of us." So the idea being that, that you do develop a style and that's it. You just, that's it. That way people can pigeonhole you forever. And that's kind of what set Max apart from pretty much every other artist except maybe Picasso. But it was the driving force that kept his creativity constantly sort of fertilized. Probably should have found a better word for that one.
Do you think we can open it up to some questions, do you think? I know we could keep talking for a while. Anybody in the audience have any questions? Just raise your hand. I think there are mics around. I still have questions, actually, but go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. These, so you said these are cast from the original. These are cast from the original pieces that were in the house, right? So the house was pretty much dominated by these sculptures all around. And what was the choice in making certain ones that you wanted and not the rest? And Max's interest was for them to stay there, but these were made by you guys. The choices were made by you, right?
The choices were made actually. The choices were made more on the basis of those works that were those pieces that still could be cast. These were done in concrete on the outside of the house, and were never properly sort of cared for during their period there. So a lot of them wore away. For example, you know, the Sphinx and Siren over there, the Siren doesn't have a head because it fell off. So the choices, the decisions on what to cast was based more on what was castable.
I think we should also note, we haven't really talked about it, is that Max and Dorothea have a beautiful home in Sedona, Arizona, a little closer to home here, called Capricorn Hill. And he approached Capricorn Hill and other homes in a similar manner that he did to Saint Martin d'Ardèche, where the home became like an art project in itself. And I just find this like unquenchable desire for him, like maybe this ADHD that you're talking about, very, very entertaining. I mean, it's, and in that home, these sculptures are very, to me, very Carrington influenced. I can say that as a Carrington expert, but the ones in Sedona, which I've also visited, seem like they're more Max. I mean, they're done later in life. I think his iconography is more mature at that point.
Well, these were done in 38 and 39. He moved to Sedona in the late 40s when his marriage to Peggy Guggenheim fell apart, in no small part because of Max's philandering. And New York became a very uncomfortable place for him after the marriage fell apart. And he had seen the landscape in Arizona when driving cross country and was enamored of the fact that he had been painting a landscape he had never seen before. So when he had to leave, this was a place that he went. The difference in the sculptures, and they built a house from the ground up. And he basically, on the cinder blocks around the house, put these gargoyles and faces and these friezes. And the difference between them and what you would find in Ardèche is that Ardèche, as I've mentioned, was a time of great fear, great trepidation. When he moved to Arizona with Dorothea Channing, his new love, it was more with a sense of hope and with a positivity that you get from the pieces there. The gargoyles, the faces, the masks are at bottom very funny. I mean, I have to confess, as a 5 or 6 year old kid, some of them I didn't find so cool. I remember there was one just outside the front door. It had this pipe that was used for a nose. And I'm looking and staring at it. And as I'm staring at it, this tarantula crawled out of the, it's like, fuck this. But so you get a definite sense of Max's frame of mind was different. And I should go back. Whenever Max did sculpture, it was always, he would kind of involve himself completely in doing that. When he did the Ardèche stuff, he did some paintings, but mostly it was this sculpture. When he moved to Arizona, until the house was built, because he was just adorning it. It's like, there was an episode of Cheers where Woody Harrelson, at the end of the episode, there's a big pile of concrete. And he goes, now what am I going to do with this concrete? It's the same thing that went through Max's mind. They're building this house. What the hell? Why don't I put some stuff on the outside? Later, when he moved back to France, and he was in a town called Wiem, once again, emphasized sculpture over everything else. And even before that, in 1944, in Glen River, New York, for about a 2-year period, just sculptures. He would use it either to get over artist block or just to play. He once described doing sculptures as, reminded him as a kid when he'd go to the beach and make sandcastles. And so quite often, these works notwithstanding, it reflected this sort of childlike exuberance that is entertaining. Even when he was political, it would always have a sense of humor about it. There's a piece, 3 large pieces entitled Big Brother and the Teaching Staff for a School of Assistants. And it's meant to be a denigration of fascist societies, fascist governments. And the 2 teaching assistants, which are supposed to be the most menacing characters there, have very phallic heads. They are dickheads. And that's how Max generally dealt with these things. It came out of his experience of Dada, which is you don't rail against something, you make fun of it. Because humor is the most castrating sort of tool that one can have against those who you feel are your oppressors.
Love that. Do we have any more questions in the audience?
Just wondering about the pedestals and the choice of how they relate to the sculptures.
The pedestals were done between my team and SHVO with a vendor here locally in San Francisco who they worked with. And it was something that they wanted to fit with the architectural choices and selections of Transamerica.
I would add that the one piece where the stand has a rather profound impact is the Sphinx and Siren over there, where it was originally built so it's against the wall of a house. And to replicate that wall, the use of a single vertical and the horizontal coming across, and then the other side supported by the mermaid's tail, is rather brilliant. I'm not sure who made that decision to cast it that way, but that really does make that piece.
Yeah, it really does. I have another question before. Do you have a question? Yes. Can you wait for a mic just a second so we get your great question on recorded?
I was curious, since your father was an artist and your grandfather was an artist, although it's focused on Max, can you tell us a little bit about their relationship as artists? And do you do anything?
I'll cover that one last. Their relationship was strangely close, but not one you would describe as typical father and son. I found it interesting that Max limited his exhibiting in New York. He showed at Alexander Yola's gallery, but he didn't do it very often. Maybe one show every 8 or 9, 10 years. Yolis built a gallery in Paris just for Max. And when Max died, Yolis closed the gallery. And it was almost as if Max was basically saying, okay, you can have America, I'll keep Europe. It wasn't the closest relationship. Max was not that kind of man. The only time Max ever told my father he loved him was the last time he saw him. And there was another instance where Jimmy, I think, must have been in his late 20s, early 30s. Max was a beautiful man, but he had these eyes, blue eyes that could just ice you out. And Jimmy once turned to him and said, you know, in your life, I'm the only one that's not afraid of you. And Max got really pissed off, and he turned to Jimmy and goes, and I'm not afraid of you either. So I think that probably encompassed the relationship. There was a respect. There's respect for my father as an artist who basically completely self-taught and developed his own style. I encourage you, if you're not familiar with his work, to look him up. I encourage you, if you're interested in 20th century art, to read his book. I did mention it, Alexander Roth Pierpoint, who writes for the New Yorker, but did a special a Saturday editorial for the Wall Street Journal about 15, 20 years ago, where she listed my father's book as one of the 5 best books ever written by an artist about being an artist. She had biography of Alice B. Toklas and Caravaggio's diaries, Hockney's book, Jimmy's, and I don't remember what the 5th one was. I'm tempted to say Warhol's A to B, but I hope not. But there was this sense of respect between the two that was not quite father and son, but more collegial.
One of the topics I wanted to get to, just come back to a little bit, is the notion of collaboration, and I think about it also as like a community. And I was taken by, we've been using this image that the amazing Lee Miller took of Leonora and Max kind of leaning up on the house as for some promotional purposes. And my communications manager said, you know, Wendi, that image has gotten like upwards of 500,000 people engaging with it. And that's not normal for us. So I was like, it can't just be this image of the two of them, but I think it's kind of what it represents. And in this like amazing resilience that these two had at this time, and the sense of community, knowing that Lee is the one taking the photo, and knowing that they were working on this house and these sculptural elements. And then I keep thinking, I'm looking out at you all, and that we're kind of sitting in this kind of community here, you know, and representing what these sculptures mean at that period of time, and working with, you know, in a neighborhood and of it itself. And I guess when I think of San Francisco, the arts community and collaboration, I know, Claudia, that's been a big thing for you all this time. And I wonder, like, just with your shows and how you've, I don't know, your collaborations with other major arts organizations, and how you're working across different artists in collaboration, whether it's Juan Getchy and your interventions at the Legion. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, what does it mean in today's world? Like, how do you, I think there's a thirst for that, as I guess I'm going back to just the attention that this project has received. And I'm wondering, are there artists that are working like that, and institutions that are working like that? And how do we continue that kind of vibe in the Bay Area as well? Because I think it's really, really important, and you're already doing it, but how?
Well, I don't have affairs with all the artists that I show. But I mean, I think one of the draws of the story too, and the work, you know, that you're telling with that image is 2 great artists, 1 great love, one of many great loves, you know. But I mean, there is such potency in the creativity, sort of like, that is unleashed, I guess, sort of like in community, if you will, in love, with these 2 figures sort of like joined. In terms of, you know, institutions, curators working with and in community, I mean, that is sort of at the center of what we do. I think if we do it successfully, we never put on an exhibition by ourselves. We always do it, you know, in dialogue with the work, in dialogue with the artists if they're alive, and, you know, and hopefully sort of like with a broader dialogue in terms of our audiences and our colleagues in mind. Since, I mean, you know, you touched specifically on the work that I do at the Legion. I mean, that is a very particular collaboration, if you will. It's really working with living artists who then situate their work in dialogue with our historical collections. And there's a community of thought that is being created in conceptualizing these exhibitions. And it is a joint thinking about who we are in this particular moment in time in relation to our histories, the histories of the world, the cultural histories. I think we do need to be talking to each other like that all the time, always. And the broader we can draw the circle, the better, you know?
Do you want to add anything for fun?
Well, that's a bit macro for me, But in a micro sense, in terms of the works here, we have come to appreciate Lenora Carrington's work over the last 10 years. The art world has been remarkably chauvinistic to the extent that women artists were ignored. And even within the context of the artists that were accepted, the women artists who were accepted by the Surrealists, the one commonality they all had, they were all really, really hot, which on some level is sort of a sexist thing in and of itself. My grandfather, you know, his involvement with Lenora, with Lenore Feeney, with, I'm trying to remember some of the other, Dorothea. These were all very attractive women. And I happen to know there are unattractive women artists who are very talented, but we look at the Surrealists, we look at these people as visionaries. By our standards, they were not. They were sexist. They were traditionalist on many levels. It's a testament to Max's love for Lenora that he actually collaborated with her, because these are not Max Ernst works alone. The piece that illustrates this perhaps most cogently is the only piece it's inside the building. It's the half demi-tete, half head, and that very
The building
much,
is going to be open, so if anybody, it's my personal favorite, and I would suggest going in. It's inside because it was inside the house in San Martin. Yeah.
and it is probably the one work that echoes Lenora more than Max. The sense looking at it as Max sort of did the bottom half, where you have the Cyclops eye character. The top half is an elongated figure that bears some resemblance to some of Max's work, like La Plus Belle, but has more of an almost Giacometti-like feel to it. And then the face itself is very much something that you could easily see in one of Lenore's paintings. But for the most part, the moments that these kind of things occurred in the art world were very few. And it's something of an indictment of, you know, my grandfather. I mean, you read Arianna Huffington's book, Picasso, Creator, Destroyer. You know, this man was a monster. But they also were monsters at a time when, in order to focus on their work, they felt they had to ignore everything else, including their families, including anything that would get in the way of their creativity. They didn't choose to become an artist because they thought it would be an easier path to a BMW. They did it because, in spite of the fact that proper society was going to castigate them, was going to cast them down, was going to look at them as they wanted to be looked at, as revolutionaries, not as cultural icons. They actually, at early years, were very offended by the concept. And so when you look at these works, you're seeing basically a man who subjugated his own sense of superiority to whoever he was involved with, to allow her to have her own voice in the works themselves, which, as I say, for my grandfather, was kind of unusual.
I would also add that I think Leonora and Dorothea are both having a little bit of a last laugh, because it's fair to say that Leonora in the last 5 or 10 years has gotten a good bit more attention than Max, and I don't think it's attention she ever would have welcomed or expected, really. So it's interesting.
I think she would have enjoyed it.
Anyway, if anybody doesn't have any other questions, I think we can conclude. The last thing I just want to do is just thank you all. Claudia, as always, thank you very much. Thank you, Eric. And I really also thank each and every one of you who've been here and come back during the daytime. It's beautiful. There's lunch out of the kiosk. It's a very lively part of the city, and we're really happy that the gallery is just a block away, and to have such great neighbors here at Transamerica. So thank you all, and have a nice night. The bar's open.